Hi, this is Linda with Overbrick Quilt Connection. I'll be doing a demo today of block 1 of the Illusions Block of the Month sampler. And we will be doing both the smaller block, the two accent strips that make up the big total block for the month. So the first thing you'll need to do is make sure that you have the correct fabrics. There are fabrics identified in your pattern, which are background and the different colors that you'll use. There's multiple backgrounds and of course 9 different colors. So you'll just need to make sure that you identify which ones we're using in this block and which ones those are. So let me tip this down so I can show you my mat. So I've got the background that we're using in the block part is this one that's kind of more white than the other multicolor. And it has these kind of little flecks of almost like a piece of grain or something like that. And first you will cut 2 5 3/4 inch squares and 1 7 1/4 inch square. Now all of these squares are going to be subcut into triangles. And you'll cut on the diagonal both directions to make your quarter square triangles. The larger triangles, let me pull one of those out. The 7 1/4 inch square, as you can see, makes, you'll be able to keep your triangles. You'll be able to tell them apart, basically. And you'll have 8 of these smaller ones and 4 of the larger ones. All right. Then from fabrics 3, 4, 7, and 8, which you'll need to identify those on your fabric list of which colors are which, you'll also be cutting 1 5 3/4 inch square of each of those 4 colors, but you'll only be using 2 of those of each color. So half of that you'll be saving, and perhaps we'll be able to use it later. If not, it'll be some waste, but we'll see. Then you will also cut a 7 1/4 inch square of each of those 4 colors, and you'll cut that in half diagonally on both ways, and you'll only be using 1 of those pieces, and the other 3 pieces then also you can just hang on to and see if we use them later. All right, to assemble, the first thing we're going to do is assemble quarter square triangles, and a quarter square triangle is made up of 4 of the same size triangles, but they're just assembled opposite each other. So the only thing you'll need to pay attention to in this case is which side of your triangles are on. I mean, you could assemble them with the light on the left or the colored on the left. In this case, it would be as you are looking at it, which I realize is opposite of how it shows on the camera. You will be, when you are looking at it, your color will be on the left and your background will be on the right. And you will put those right sides together and you will sew them from the corner out, not from the point in. The reason for that, it's just, it puts less, it's easier on your machine. When you're coming in from a point, sometimes that wants to kind of go down. The needle will kind of push it down into your feed dogs, and this way it's less likely to do that. Now, these are bias edges. They're cut on the diagonal, so they're more stretchy than this outside, the outside edge is. So you want to be careful on that when you stitch it. And then when you're done, you will be pressing it towards the color. And I like to finger press that seam. Kind of let me show you what I'm talking about here. Here is one that I've sewn. And I like to just, when I open that up, I just like to take my fingernail and kind of run it lightly down that seam. And that kind of smooths it over so you don't have any creases over here on the background side. It'll make it easy. It'll lay it down a little bit and allow you to get that pressed easily. Of each of your colors, you're going to make 2 sets of the triangle and background. And all of them will be pressed towards the color. So you'll end up with 8 of these sets. I mean, 4 of these sets of 2, sorry, 8 total units. Okay, then when you turn them around to sew them together, then that makes those seams, they're both going towards the color, so that means they will nest together. And by nesting, I mean that the seam itself, when you look at it, the seam edges will abut each other, and there should not be a gap there. They should settle in there closely. Okay, I usually put a pin there just so it doesn't slip, and then you'll sew that long seam. It has you press that then towards the color at the top. I have finished our quarter square triangle unit, and on the back you can see that I pressed the center seam one way, which they have you press it up in the pattern. I am now going to show you how to square it up or trim it down, however you refer to it, to the correct size. Now the pattern says the correct size is 4 3/4 inches. Mine is a little bit bigger than that, so I am going to have to trim it down. In order to do that, I need to find the center, and half of 4 3/4 is 2 3/8. So I'm going to find the 2 3/8 point, 2 3/8 down and 2 3/8 over. And that my center point is right here. So I'm going to put that right on where the center point, where all 4 of those pieces come together. You also need to have a 45-degree line on your ruler, and you will put that on the seam, on the diagonal seam, with the 2 3/8 right on the center point. You also need to be aware of the 4 3/4 marks on your ruler, because those need to be where the opposite seam crosses. So where 4 3/4 is, in this case the purple and the background, it's right where that seam is. And down here, 4 3/4 is also right where that seam is. Now, this is fabric, so if yours does not match it, don't hesitate to tug it a little bit to get it out to, or shove it in a little bit to get it out to where it needs to be. Because you want those 4 seams to be right in the corners of your block. Okay, I've got this lined up, so I'm going to trim 2 of the sides. Now, I just moved it, so let me line it back up here. And I'm going to put my thumb back here off of my ruler, so the rest of my fingers are holding on, and that way that will hold it more secure as I'm trimming my 2 sides. All right, now I'm going to turn my block around, and this time the 2 sides that I lined up, or that I already trimmed, I'm going to line up on the 4 3/4 line on my ruler. And then I'm also going to make sure that the center, the 2 3/8, is right on that center point still, that my 45-degree line is right on that seam. And again, that my seams on the two opposite corners, that the 4 3/4 is right where that seam is. And again, if you need to tug it or push it to make that happen, go ahead and do that. And I'm going to trim these other 2 sides. And now we have a 4 3/4 inch quarter square triangle. All right, you'll do that with all 4 of them because you're making 4 different colors of these. So here's the blue and the green and the dark red. All right, so the next step is adding, you're going to add the large background and a large colored, if you will, triangle to each of those to make a larger unit. The first piece you'll sew on is the large background. So you want to lay your piece with the color to the left, one of the colored sides to the left. Then you will lay your background piece with the square corner to the bottom of that unit, just like that. So it makes a straight edge. You'll flip that over and then sew this seam and press it back towards this background. So I've already completed that on this side, on this color. Now, this sticks up a little bit, as you can see, off of the end. And what I usually do is I trim that off next to the edge of the background fabric because of the original quarter square triangle unit. The reason I do that is because that gives me then, this is going to be the next place that I stitch, and I cut it with the back side up so I can see where that unit line is, and then I just trim off next to that. The reason I do that is because it will then give me a straight edge to sew my next piece to. Now, there are some people that like to leave those on because they like to use that like a little handle so they can stitch the next seam. But I tend to catch that in, and then sometimes it makes my seam wobbly. All right, it tells you to sew one of your colored fabrics to the opposite side. So to do that, I put the piece that I just sewed to the top and have, then you'll be sewing next to the background this time. So you'll lay one of the square corner of one of your large triangles. So where, again, that's a straight line, and you'll sew that, flip that over and sew from the square corner down. And you will then, when that's sewed, you'll press that out. I have one of those units made, so it's now a completed unit. It does not mention squaring those up at all, so we will, like this one, mine is just a little uneven, if you can see that. But that's going to be on the outer edge of our block. These are the straight edges of the fabric, and they're going to be on the outside edges of our block. So we may be able to trim that up just a little more even once the entire block is done. You will end up making 4 of these units, and they'll be all different colors, and you can determine which colored big triangle is paired with the which quarter square triangle colors. That's your choice, or you can do it like the pattern, color it like the pattern. It's entirely up to you. I will finish all that, and I'm going to come back and show you the next step then of how to put all that together. I have all 4 of my triangle units made. And again, your color combinations may differ from mine because you get to choose those color combinations. But I have all 4 of them, and I have them laid out, and we are making yet another quarter square triangle out of all these units. So we will have 2 of them that we will sew together. So put them right sides together. And we will be intersecting these seams here. As you can see, they should lock in with each other the way they're pressed. But then when we get out here, we have seams that do not intersect because we're pressing everything out. So let me put some pins in this, and I'll show you how I handle that. So this one, as I said, will be intersected. So those will abut or nest. And I'm going to put a pin where those cross. Then here, where these two, this underneath seam here, where the 2 diagonal seams cross, those do, the fabric does nest there. But these seams where we added on the big triangles do not. So in that case, you can do a couple of things. You can put a pin on either side of that thick, so those don't wiggle off of each other is what I'm trying to prevent. There's also something called a fork pin, and you can talk to Amy at Overbrook Quilt Connection if you don't have those, but it's the same concept except they're already attached. And so you just make sure that your seam allowances are on top of each other, and then you pin both sides of that in at the same time, and then that in effect does the same thing. There's a seam on or a pin on either side of the seam allowance, so then it doesn't wiggle on you. All right, so then we're going to sew that seam. I'm going to do the same thing with this other set of 2. I'm going to put them on top of each other, and I'm going to nest those diagonal seams, and I'm going to pin that. And then I'm going to make sure that these diagonals are nested with each other. And I'm feeling that with my fingers to where there's not a gap in between those where those seams are. You can, when they're not nested, you can kind of feel a little dip there with your fingertips. And again, I'm putting the 2 seam allowances of where we added on the big triangle, I'm putting those on top of each other. And then I am using a fork pin, and I am just pinning those in. All right. I'm matching the final point. Again, I'm going to start sewing from this end. So be careful of your pins. Take them out if you can. If you can't, if you have to sew over them very, very slowly. I will come back and show you the next step. I have sewn the 2 halves together into 2 really large triangles, and as you can see, I matched them pretty well on that cross seam. The next step then will be to sew the 2 halves together into one big block. Let me do that, and I'll show you what comes next. Actually, let me show you how these are pinned together. we have all these seams coming in together where the diagonal seams and the straight seams cross each other. So all of that will nestle together. And I'm going to put a pin on that so it doesn't move. Then once again, we have those same match points that we had when we were sewing the halves together, where we're going to match those seams out here with when we sewed on the big triangles. So it's the same type of seam we had before, it's just 2 halves of it. So once again, I'm looking at it, I'm checking to make sure all that matches. I'm using a fork pin again, but you like I said, you can use 2 pins if you want. I think pinning them together at the same time makes them less likely to slip when you're putting in one versus the other, but it's your choice. Now, if you've got an area that is a little bit, this one is a little bit wavier or a little bit bigger, if you will, than the bottom layer. Maybe it's stretched a little bit when I pressed it or something. So I'm going to put a pin in that also, just so it doesn't want to travel along and make a fold there. All right, now I'm going to sew this seam. I've sewn this center seam, but I want to draw your attention to a couple of match points. I don't know if you can see, there is an X there of my stitching lines. When you sew this seam across the center to join the 2 units, your stitches should go right on the inside edge of that X on both sides. And of course, one of my sides is the background, so you can't see my light stitching there. But you want to make sure that that runs right on the inside of that X, and that is what's going to make your points then not be cut off or not be left with a lot of white hanging out in them. So this is, let me turn the camera up just a little bit so you can see our finished block. So this block is our completed, and again, your colors may not be the same in the same layout as mine. The block at this point should measure 12.5 inches. Now I'm going to put my ruler on here and measure it and see where we are. If your block is at least 12.5 inches, you're good to go. If it is less than that by quite a bit, you may need to change your seam allowance and make it a little smaller so your block is a little bigger. If your block is bigger than that, you may be able to trim it down, but again, you might want to change your seam allowance to where it's bigger. I mean, your seam allowance would be deeper, so then your block would be smaller if it's bigger than 12.5. If it's smaller than 12.5, make your seam allowance smaller so your block is bigger. I hope I didn't just confuse the heck out of you. But my block is pretty close to 12.5. I've just got some little tips to trim off. So I will do that. It's the same exact, my technique is what we used on the smaller segments. But my 12.5 inch ruler has both diagonals on it. So I'm able to tell that all my seams do come into the corners correctly. So that's what I'm talking about here. The diagonals are on the diagonal seams of the block. So I'm good to go here. The next step we'll be doing is making our accent strips. And there is separate cutting sections for the accent strips from the block because we're using a different background. And let me grab those pieces. We will be making, first we will be making, we'll be cutting squares, and we will be sewing these squares together in 2 different segments. The first thing we will do is take our, and they are 2.5-inch squares. You'll be sewing a background, and in this case we've used the gray background. You will be, which would be background 3, and squares of each of the different colors, and it has you use all 9 colors and cut 1 2.5-inch square of each, and cut 2 of fabric 7, which is the blue one. So all the rest of them you'll cut 1. Then the first thing we'll do, but you can go ahead and pair them up and sew them all. Just don't press them yet because they have you press them different directions. You will press, you'll decide which colors you want put into, we're going to make a 4-patch unit. So you'll decide which colors you want in that, and then you will sew, again, you'll sew one background to one color, and you will press them towards the color. Then you will take those 2 separate units and you will pair them up with the seams going opposite each other. You'll sew that seam and you will press it towards the top. And you have a 4-patch unit that should measure 4.5 inches. And if your squares start at 2.5 and your seam allowances are correct, this should be 4.5 inches. You should not have to square it up, I guess is what I'm trying to say. All right, then to finish the accent strip, you will sew 2, you'll take your segments of 2s that you've made, and you will sew them together into a finished strip. And it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4 segments of 2. So 8 total squares in this segment. And you will press them all the same direction. So they have you press them to the right in this case, from left to right. And so here are mine already pressed. All right, then we'll make another strip that's of, now the first strip that we sewed started with a colored square and ended with a background square. The other one will be opposite. We will start with a background square and we'll sew our 4 segments together again. Let me put this down a little bit more so you can see my board better. So again, we'll be doing 4 in a row. Now, what I would suggest is that you lay out your color combinations so you don't, so you like the arrangement of your colors. So the second strip is going, the first strip again started with a color, ended with a background. This one will start with a background, end with a color. And I'll finish that strip and then I'll show you how to join the 2 together. The 2 strips are done. They should be the same length as each other. If they're not, you're going to need to adjust your seam allowances in order to make that happen. And they should measure 16.5 inches long by 2.5 inches wide. The next thing we're going to do is join those 2 strips together. I forgot to say on your second strip, since we pressed the first strip, the seams from left, we pressed them towards the right. This, on the second one, we're going to press them towards the left, from right to left. All right, so that means then when you put these two together, your seam allowances will all nest with each other all the way across. And I'm going to pin this entire seam just to make sure those don't slip. So let me finish that seam, and then I'll come back and show you the next step. I have sewn this piece together, the two strips, and it should now measure 16.5 long by 4.5 inch wide. And again, if you have to adjust your seam allowances to get to that measurement, please do so. So our first accent strip is complete, and it consists of this plus the original 4 patch that we made. So we'll set those off to the side along with our 12.5 inch block that we just made. And now we're going to make the other accent strip. We are again doing quarter square triangles, but instead of them all being the same fabric in both sides, we're going to mix them up. So you can join all of your colors to the background in that first seam. And again, your color is on the left, background on the right, and so from the corner out. And you'll make all of your colors, and you have two, and let me backtrack just a little bit. When you're cutting those, you're not using all 9 of your colors. You're using fabrics 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, and 9. And you're only going to use 2 of the triangles when you do your diagonal cut. You're only going to use 2 of them, so you'll have 2 left. All right. Then, as I said, then join to your background. Once you have them all joined, and you're going to press them towards the left, towards the color, then you're going to again do that center seam, and those seams will nest where you're putting them together. But you get to pick the color combinations again. So match them up however you would like. And this time they will be squared up to 4.5 inches. I've already shown you that, so it's the exact same technique we used earlier. I will match these up, square them up, and then come back and show you how to finish our block assembly. I decided to show you squaring up to 4.5 inches since the last time we did it to 4 3/4. This time I'm using a different ruler, and this ruler is an Eleanor Burns Quilt in a Day ruler called a Fussy Cut ruler. And if you have seen any of my Block of the Month demos in the shop, you will know that I use these rulers a lot. They have they come in some standard sizes in a set, and they have both diagonals marked. And so since this is 4.5 and I have a 4.5 inch one of those rulers, I'm going to use it to square these up. That way you can put all 4 seams. Let me see if I can show this to you. All 4 seams are on the lines all at one time. So you can tell that you have it centered, you can tell that you have it straight. So I've got my thumb kind of hanging off on the edge here to hold it from twisting as I cut, and I'm going to trim 2 of my sides. Then turn it around, line it up again with all 4 corners. Again, line it up with my thumb off of the back and trim my last two sides. So then it's squared up nicely with the corners, with the seams all in the corners. I'm going to square up the rest of mine. I'll show you the next step. I have trimmed all these up to 4.5 inches, and we're going to connect them all into one long strip. Now, they will be opposite each other, so you start with one that is the colors on the top and bottom, and you join it to one that has the colors going side to side. You will lay them all out like that and again, you are determining your color combinations, so yours will probably be different than mine. And then you lay them all out in a row, and you're going to join these seams together. Now, once again, I'm going to pin my corners because you've got the diagonal seams coming down into those corners, and I don't want them to shift. So I'm going to press. Now, sometimes, since they have us pressing them to one side, once again, this one does not nest. Now, I'm not going to use a fork pin there because it's not a straight seam. You could, but then my pin would be on the diagonal, and that's really hard for the machine to figure out as you're sewing over that. So, and it's a really hard angle to get the pin out as you get to that point. So that's why I'm just pressing it, or just pinning it once there. I'm going to pin all these together then, and that will be the finish of our second accent strip. I have finished accent strip 2. Again, it starts with a block that has the colors top and bottom joined to one that has it side to side, and you end the strip with, so you start top and bottom, you end side to side. And you will press all your seams from left to right. So all your seams will be pressed this direction. This strip should measure 24.5 inches when you're done. The next step then is assembling all of these segments into one block. There's additional cutting of an additional background. So I'll come back and show you that step. We are ready for the final step of making our complete big block. And so there are cutting directions for the last piece of fabric that we need for this block, which is background 1, which is the one that's mostly a solid. And so you will first put two 2.5 by 12.5 inch strips, one on either side of your block. Sew those on and press them towards the sashing. And then you will take 2.5 by 16.5 inch strips and sew them to the top and the bottom. And then this square will now be 16.5 inches. I mean, it'll be 16.5 inches square. You will press these out towards the sashing strips also. The sashing frame is now put around all 4 sides, and it measures 16.5 inches square. So the next step we will do will be to put the accent strips on. The first piece will be the 16.5 inch 4-patch, if you will, kind of strip. And that will be placed next to your square. Let me move this over. That'll be placed next to your square. And it would be, for me, it would be on the right-hand side of the square. We will also place one of our large 4.5 by 16.5 inch rectangles beside that. I would sew these two strips together and then put them onto the big piece, just so you don't have to handle the big piece quite so much. So we'll do that step. Then the next step is to join the one single 4-patch that we made with the remaining long 4.5 inch strip and the one 4.5 inch square, and make that into a long strip. And then that will be sewn to the bottom of the square with the two pieces added to it. So let me finish that and then I'll come back again. I have the 2-strip section added to the block now. As you can see, it's a big rectangle. And I seamed this other section that's going to go at the very bottom of the block. Now, one thing I need to bring to your attention is that this is meant to look as if it is continuing the pattern, even though they won't be right next to each other. So when you sew this 4-patch into these, make sure that the background is on the left and the color is on the right when you sew that in. So the way I did it first, I did it opposite. I had it turned the opposite way, and so there were two collars next to each other. And when I put it on the ironing board to press, it was like, oh, no, that's not right. I'm not continuing the pattern. So make sure you're continuing the pattern. All right. The last section we'll put in is this row of hourglass units. And it should be the same length as this big piece and this smaller piece. Now, if you'll notice, these colors are the same colors as what's in here. So I'm not going to use that. I'm going to turn it the opposite direction just so I have a little bit of color variance there. And I'm going to sew the hourglass strip to the pieced border strip or sashing strip. And then once those two are sewn together, I will sew that piece to the bottom and our block will be done. Before I sew this piece to the big rectangle to finish the block, I want to show you something. I ended up sewing this and then taking it all back apart. The reason being, when I flipped it end for end, because I didn't want the colors to be the same, I ended up with a background, with a block that had background top and bottom. And that messes up the pattern again, because the color is supposed to be next to the color. And you're supposed to have a block that the color's going up and down when it meets with this. That helps with the illusion of these being woven. So I ended up taking these two seams out, sliding this down, taking a block off of this end and moving it down. And then now I will sew it all back together again. The reason I'm telling you this is because, we all make mistakes, and I'm hoping to try and keep you from making some of the same mistakes that I make. So, anyhow, I will sew the rest of this together and I will show you the finished block. I have the block finished now, so you can see that it is complete with the two accent strips attached. There are some things I did with the colors that kind of bugged me a little bit. For instance, I'm not fond of these two being the same fabric that come together, but I did it anyway. I'm not real fond of that being the same right there, but I am not bugged enough about it to take them back out. So you all, by knowing what I did wrong, can do better. So that's another reason I tell you when I do things wonky, because it will help you in the long run. So I hope you've enjoyed making this block. I did enjoy it, even though I took some seams out and redid them, but I did enjoy it. And we will see you back again for block 2.